August 17th, 1424. The fields outside Verneuil in Normandy shimmered under an afternoon sun that would soon illuminate one of the most savage battles of the 100 Years' War. On an open plain, a mile north of the town, two armies stood facing each other across ground that had been deliberately chosen for its flatness, perfect terrain for the heavy cavalry that the French believed would decide the day. Neither side knew they were about to participate in what the English would call a second Agincourt, a battle so ferocious that chroniclers who'd witnessed both conflicts would declare Verneuil the more terrible of the two. John of Lancaster, Duke of Bedford, third son of Henry IV, and brother to the late King Henry V, surveyed the enemy formation from atop his warhorse. At 35 years old, Bedford had spent much of his adult life defending his brother's conquests in France. Since Henry's untimely death from dysentery 2 years earlier, Bedford had served as regent for his 9-month-old nephew, Henry VI, shouldering the immense burden of maintaining English control over northern France against a resurgent enemy. The weight of that responsibility showed in the calculated patience with which he studied the Franco-Scottish army arrayed before him. The situation Bedford faced would have daunted a lesser commander. His army numbered perhaps 9,000 or 10,000 men, drawn from English reinforcements and the garrisons of towns and castles across Normandy. Facing him stood a combined force of roughly 15,000 soldiers, representing an international coalition assembled by the Dauphin Charles, who called himself Charles VII of France, despite English claims that the infant Henry VI was the rightful king of both England and France under the Treaty of Troyes. The enemy formation stretched across the road leading northeast toward Damville. On the right of the road stood the Scots, perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 strong, commanded by two of Scotland's most powerful nobles. Archibald Douglas, 4th Earl of Douglas, was one of the wealthiest and most influential men in Scotland. John Stuart, Earl of Buchan, had led Scottish forces in France since 1419 and had recently been elevated to the prestigious position of Constable of France after the stunning Scottish victory at Beaujeu 3 years earlier. That battle had seen Scottish arms defeat English forces and kill Henry V's brother, the Duke of Clarence, giving the Scots immense confidence in their ability to best the English in open combat. To the left of the road stood the French contingent under Jean d'Aumale, Count of Aumale, accompanied by the Viscount of Narbonne. D'Aumale had recently defeated English forces at La Brossinière and Burgundian forces at La Boussière, earning him a reputation as a capable commander who understood how to beat the English. His French troops, perhaps 6,000 or 7,000 strong, included nobles and professional. Men-at-arms alongside levies raised through the arrière ban, the feudal summons that had been enforced to assemble this army. The quality of the French forces varied considerably, with some poorly armed and inadequately trained troops mixed among the professional soldiers and armoured nobles. Most dramatically, positioned in front of both the Scots and French formations, stood 2,000 heavily armoured cavalrymen from Lombardy and Castile. These Italian mercenaries, hired from Filippo Maria Visconti, Duke of Milan, represented the cutting edge of military technology. Clad in complete suits of tempered steel plate armour and mounted on barded horses, their armour covering even their steeds, they embodied everything medieval warfare was supposed to be about: the thundering charge of heavy cavalry, the shock of steel against steel, the raw power of mounted knights smashing through enemy formations. A smaller Milanese cavalry force had been decisive against the Burgundians at La Boussière the previous September, and the Franco-Scottish command believed these armoured horsemen would prove equally devastating against Bedford's English. Both the Scottish and French men-at-arms had dismounted for battle, following the practice that had become standard during the 100 Years' War after repeated bitter experience taught commanders that horses were too vulnerable to English arrow fire. The mounted Milanese, however, came from Italy, where they had no such experience. They refused what they considered the professional humiliation of fighting on foot, confident that their superior armour would protect them from anything the English could throw at them. Bedford's formation mirrored the enemy deployment in its basic structure, but differed critically in its composition. His men-at-arms, perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 strong, formed the centre. These were professional soldiers, knights and men-at-arms who had fought in France under Henry V and now served under Bedford. They wore plate armour, carried poleaxes, swords and lances, and represented the elite of English military power. But they were not the core of Bedford's army. That distinction belonged to the longbowmen, who comprised perhaps 2/3 of Bedford's force. 6 or 7,000 English and Welsh archers deployed on the wings and in front of the men-at-arms, protected by sharpened wooden stakes driven into the ground at angles designed to impale charging cavalry. These men carried the weapon that had dominated European battlefields for nearly a century, the English warbow, a 6-foot staff of yew capable of driving a bodkin point arrow through mail at 200 yards. Each archer carried 2 sheaves of 24 arrows, giving him 48 shots before he would need to scavenge from the dead or rely on resupply. The English longbow was more than just a powerful weapon. It represented a completely different philosophy of warfare than the one embraced by the French and their allies, where continental powers relied on heavily armoured cavalry and dismounted men-at-arms fighting in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The English had developed a system that used missile fire to disrupt enemy formations before their heavy infantry moved in to finish the job. The longbow could loose arrows at a rate of 10 to 12 per minute in the hands of a skilled archer, creating storms of projectiles that could break cavalry charges, disorder infantry formations, and inflict casualties from ranges where the enemy could not effectively respond. Training a longbowman took years. English law required regular archery practice, and boys began learning the bow in childhood. By the time a man joined the army, he had the strength to draw the 120 to 150 pound draw weight required to use a warbow effectively, and the skill to hit man-sized targets at distance. This investment in training created a professional corps of missile troops that no continental power could match. The Scots had their own archery tradition, but their bows lacked the draw weight and range of the English weapons. The French relied primarily on crossbowmen, who could achieve penetration comparable to longbows but at a much slower rate of fire. Behind Bedford's main battle line, a baggage park held the army's supplies, spare weapons, and the horses belonging to the dismounted men-at-arms. The wagons were formed into a square with the horses tethered inside, tied to each other to prevent their easy removal. A guard of perhaps 2,000 archers and camp followers protected this vital logistics base. The two armies had faced each other since shortly after dawn, each waiting for the other to abandon the defensive advantage and attack first. This standoff reflected the fundamental tactical problem both commanders faced. Attacking across open ground against a prepared enemy invited disaster, as the French had learned at Crécy and Agincourt. But sitting still achieved nothing. As the day wore on toward late afternoon, both sides began to move forward, neither willing to cede the battlefield without a fight. At approximately 4 in the afternoon, with the sun beginning its descent toward the western horizon, the Franco-Scottish army initiated the battle. The Viscount of Narbonne's French men-at-arms surged forward, and the English lines erupted with a cheer, the traditional English battle cry that had preceded combat since time immemorial. Within 250 yards of the Franco-Scottish line, Bedford's archers halted and planted their protective stakes, creating a barrier of sharpened wooden points between themselves and the enemy. Then the Milanese cavalry charged. 2,000 armoured horsemen spurred their mounts forward, thundering across the open ground toward the English formation. The earth shook with the impact of 8,000 hooves striking the ground in near unison. This was the moment for which these knights had trained since childhood, the ultimate expression of medieval martial prowess, the heavy cavalry charge that had dominated European warfare for centuries. The English archers opened fire. Thousands of arrows arced into the sky, creating a sound contemporaries compared to the tearing of silk magnified 1,000-fold. The bodkin point arrows, designed specifically to penetrate armour, struck the advancing cavalry with the force of hammers. But these were not the lightly armoured French knights of Crécy or Agincourt. The Milanese wore the finest plate armour Italian craftsmen could forge, and their horses were protected by steel barding. Arrows that would have killed lesser cavalry bounced off or glanced away from the tempered steel. The Milanese cavalry brushed aside the arrow barrage that had broken so many French charges in the past. They crashed through the protective stakes, their armoured horses simply trampling the wooden barriers that had stopped previous attacks. The shock of their impact shattered the English archer formation on one wing, sending hundreds of longbowmen fleeing in panic. The Milanese had achieved what French cavalry had failed to do at Crécy, at Poitiers, at Agincourt. They had broken the English archer screen and penetrated the English formation. The cavalry swept past Bedford's main battle line and fell upon the baggage park. Finding it lightly defended and full of plunder, many of the Milanese dismounted and began looting. Others rode around the English formation's flank, creating chaos in the English rear. One wing of Bedford's longbowmen had been routed, his baggage train was under attack, and his army was partially surrounded. From the Franco-Scottish perspective, the battle appeared to be going exactly according to plan. But while the cavalry rampage created havoc in the English rear areas, the main event was unfolding in the centre of the battlefield. The Scottish and French men-at-arms, seeing the cavalry success, advanced toward the English line. These were not the undisciplined feudal levies that had charged recklessly at Agincourt. They moved forward in good order, maintaining their formation, advancing at a walk to preserve their stamina for the brutal work ahead. The two lines of armoured men met with a crash that could be heard a mile away. What followed was described by Jean de Wavrin, a Burgundian chronicler who fought in the battle on the English side, as hand-to-hand combat whose ferocity astounded even contemporaries. Wavrin had witnessed Agincourt 9 years earlier. He had seen the battle at Crevant, but he would later write that Verneuil was the most formidable and best fought of them all. The melee that developed defied easy description. Thousands of armoured men, packed together in formations so tight they could barely swing their weapons, hacked and stabbed at each other with poleaxes, swords, warhammers and maces. Wavrin recalled how the blood of the dead spread on the field, and that of the wounded ran in great streams all over the earth. For 45 minutes, perhaps 3/4 of an hour, the two sides hammered at each other without either gaining a clear advantage. This was where the English bill proved its deadly worth. The bill was a polearm adapted from an agricultural implement, featuring a curved blade, a hooked back spike, and a thrusting spike on top. In the hands of trained infantry, it was devastatingly effective against armoured opponents. The hook could catch armour plates and drag enemies to the ground or pull them out of formation. The blade could chop with axe-like power. The spike could thrust through gaps in armour or batter at helmets and visors. English billmen worked in brutal synchronisation with their men-at-arms. While knights wielding poleaxes crashed against Scottish and French opponents, billmen used their hooks to drag enemies out of formation, pulling them down where they could be finished off with sword thrusts to vulnerable points or simply trampled under the press of bodies. The versatility of the bill, its ability to hook, thrust and chop, made it ideal for the brutal compressed fighting where men stood shoulder to shoulder with barely room to swing their weapons. Bedford himself fought in the front ranks, something medieval commanders were expected to do. He wielded a two-handed poleaxe, one of the most devastating weapons in medieval arsenals. A poleaxe combined a hammerhead on one side with an axe blade on the other, topped with a spike for thrusting. In skilled hands it could smash through armour like tin, crushing the body underneath before the victim even registered the blow. One veteran recalled that Bedford reached no one whom he did not fell. The historian Desmond Seward would later note that a poleaxe could smash open expensive armour like a modern tin can, with the body inside crushed and mangled. The presence of a commander in the front ranks was more than just martial prowess. It was psychological warfare. Bedford wore distinctive heraldic attire combining the White Cross of France with the Red Cross of England, a powerful statement of his claim to Regent of France for his nephew Henry VI. His participation in the fight sent a message to his men. If the Regent himself was willing to risk death in the melee, how could they do any less? As the central melee ground on without resolution, the battle's outcome hung in balance. The Milanese cavalry had broken one English wing and captured the baggage train, but they had effectively removed themselves from the decisive combat, distracted by plunder and disorder. The archers they had routed began to rally and regroup. These were professional soldiers, men who had survived multiple campaigns. Panic was temporary. Once they recovered from the initial shock, they began filtering back toward the battlefield. The Scottish and French forces fought with desperate determination. They knew this battle could decide the war. A victory here would shatter English power in our northern France, avenge Agincourt, and restore French control over Normandy. The Scots fought with particular ferocity, driven by their recent triumph at Beaujeu and their pride in having proven they could defeat English armies. But ferocity and determination could not overcome the fundamental problem they faced. The English men-at-arms, supported by billmen, were slowly, methodically cutting their way through the Franco-Scottish formation. The poleaxes, bills and warhammers, wielded by Bedford's heavy infantry, proved brutally effective in close-quarters combat. More critically, as rallied English archers began to re-enter the fight, they created a devastating asymmetry. The Franco-Scottish forces faced enemies on multiple sides, with fresh archers now attacking their flanks and rear, while the main English line continued pressing forward. The longbowmen who returned to combat did not waste time retrieving their stakes or reforming in perfect order. They simply began shooting into the packed mass of Franco-Scottish troops from close range. At distances of 50 to 100 yards, even the finest armour became vulnerable. Arrows found gaps at the joints, penetrated visors, struck unprotected faces and necks. The bodkin points, designed to concentrate impact on a tiny point, punched through mail and found weak spots in plate harnesses. The psychological impact of arrow fire at close range was as devastating as the physical damage. Men locked in brutal hand-to-hand combat suddenly found themselves struck from unexpected angles by projectiles they never saw coming. The hiss of arrows became a constant background terror, adding another layer of horror to the already nightmarish experience of close-quarters melee. The turning point came when the English launched a coordinated assault on the Scottish flank. Regrouped archers and men-at-arms who had been held in reserve crashed into the Scots from an unexpected direction. The Scottish formation, already under immense pressure from Bedford's central push, began to buckle. Once cracks appeared in the wall of shields and bodies, the fractures spread rapidly. Medieval combat operated under brutal mathematics. A formation that held together could fight effectively, with men supporting each other, protecting vulnerable points, maintaining defensive integrity. But once a formation broke, once men began to flee, the fight transformed instantly from battle to slaughter. Fleeing soldiers presented their backs to enemies, making them easy targets for arrows, axes, and swords. They could not defend themselves while running. They abandoned wounded comrades. They created gaps others could exploit. The Scottish formation shattered. What had been an organised body of fighting men dissolved into a mob of fleeing soldiers. The French, seeing their Scottish allies break, wavered. Within minutes, the entire Franco-Scottish centre was in full retreat. The English men-at-arms and archers pursued, and what followed was massacre. Contemporary accounts describe the slaughter in terms that still shock centuries later. The fields of Verneuil became what Wavrin called a bloody meadow. The town ditch filled with bodies until it ran red with blood. Fleeing soldiers were cut down from behind. Groups that tried to make stands were surrounded and destroyed. The Milanese cavalry, returning from their plundering expedition to find the battle lost, were caught in the general rout and suffered terrible casualties. The casualty figures, even allowing for medieval exaggeration, were staggering. Some 6,000 Franco-Scottish soldiers died on the field or in the pursuit that followed. Perhaps 200 more were captured. Among the dead were both Scottish commanders, Archibald Douglas, Earl of Douglas, and John Stewart, Earl of Buchan, cut down as their army disintegrated around them. The Count of Aumerle, Viscount of Narbonne, and numerous other French nobles perished. The Scottish army, which had numbered perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 men, was effectively annihilated. Of those who had marched onto the field that morning, fewer than 1,000 would see Scotland again. English casualties were far lighter, though estimates varied wildly. Bedford claimed to have lost only 2 men-at-arms and a very few archers, a figure so impossibly low it can be dismissed as propaganda. Wavrin, fighting on the English side, estimated 1,600 English dead, which likely included wounded who died after the battle. Even this higher figure represented a fraction of Franco-Scottish losses, reflecting the brutal reality that most casualties in medieval battles occurred during the rout, when one side broke and fled. The Battle of Verneuil lasted perhaps 3 hours from the initial charge to the final pursuit. In that time, the balance of power in northern France shifted decisively. The Army of Scotland, which had been a major factor in French military planning since 1419, ceased to exist as a coherent force. Individual Scots would continue to serve in French armies, but Scotland would not send another major expedition to France during the 100 Years' War. The disaster at Verneuil, coming just 3 years after the triumph at Beaugé, crippled Scotland's ability and willingness to support their French allies. For Charles VII, the Dauphin who claimed the French throne, Verneuil was catastrophic. He lost his principal military commander, the Constable of France, along with thousands of irreplaceable professional soldiers. The Scottish troops had been his most reliable forces, tough professionals who could face English armies without flinching. Their destruction forced him to rebuild his military from scratch, a process that would take years and require the intervention of a peasant girl named Joan of Arc before French fortunes would finally turn. For Bedford, Verneuil represented the pinnacle of his military career. He had faced a numerically superior enemy, survived a devastating cavalry assault that broke part of his formation, and still managed to achieve overwhelming victory through superior discipline, better tactics, and the devastating effectiveness of English combined arms warfare. The victory secured English control of Normandy for years to come and validated the tactical system Henry V had perfected. The weapons that decided Verneuil deserve closer examination because they reveal fundamental truths about medieval warfare that often get lost in popular imagination. The English longbow, despite its fame, did not win the battle alone. The Milanese cavalry had proven that heavily armoured troops could survive and break through arrow storms that would have shattered lighter formations. What won Verneuil was the combination of longbow, billmen, and men-at-arms working in coordinated fashion. The bill, in particular, deserves recognition as one of the most effective infantry weapons of the late medieval period. Descended from agricultural tools, bills had evolved by the 15th century into sophisticated weapons optimized for close-quarters combat against armoured opponents. The English distinguished between several varieties including the black bill, brown bill, and forest bill, though the precise differences between these types remain unclear to modern historians. A typical English bill featured a curved blade roughly a foot to 18 inches long, mounted on a 6-foot ashwood shaft. The blade's curve allowed devastating chopping blows, concentrating force like an axe. The hook on the back of the blade could catch helmets, armour plates, shields, or weapons, allowing a billman to control and manipulate opponents. The spike on top permitted thrusting attacks that could penetrate gaps in armour or batter against defences. The entire assembly weighed around 5 pounds, light enough for sustained use but heavy enough to deliver crushing blows. The versatility of the bill made it ideal for the kind of fluid, chaotic combat that developed at Verneuil. When formations crashed together and movement became restricted, a billman could hook an enemy's weapon or armour and drag him out of position, creating openings for comrades to exploit. The hook could pull enemies off balance or drag them to the ground where they became vulnerable to finishing blows. The spike allowed quick thrusts when opportunities presented. The blade could deliver axe-like chopping attacks when space permitted. Historical accounts from slightly later in the 15th century praised the bill's effectiveness. George Silver, a 16th century English weapons master, called it the most deadly of all two-handed weapons. At the Battle of Flodden in 1513, English billmen would again prove devastatingly effective against Scottish pike formations, demonstrating that the weapon's utility extended beyond the specific circumstances of Verneuil. The poleaxe wielded by Bedford and other nobles represented the elite weapon of late medieval warfare. Unlike the bill, which evolved from peasant tools, the poleaxe was designed from the beginning as a weapon for heavily armoured combat. It typically featured a 4 to 6 foot shaft topped with a complex head, combining multiple striking surfaces. One side might feature a hammer face for crushing blows, the other an axe blade for chopping. A spike on top allowed thrusting. Some variants included a hook similar to a bill's. The poleaxe was specifically designed to defeat the finest plate armour that 15th century metallurgy could produce. The hammer face could deliver crushing impacts that bent armour inward, breaking bones without penetrating the steel. The axe blade could shear through mail and cut into plate armour with properly angled blows. The spike could find gaps between armour plates or batter through weakened sections. In skilled hands, a poleaxe made even the best armoured knight vulnerable. Bedford's effective use of the poleaxe at Verneuil demonstrated the weapon's brutal efficiency. Contemporary accounts describe him felling every opponent he reached, cutting through the Franco-Scottish formation like a harvester through wheat. The poleaxe's reach, roughly 6 to 8 feet including the wielder's arm extension, allowed its user to strike before opponents with shorter weapons could respond. Its multiple striking surfaces meant the wielder could adapt to different tactical situations without switching weapons. The longbow's role at Verneuil, while less decisive than at Agincourt, remained crucial. The Milanese cavalry breakthrough demonstrated that armour technology had advanced to the point where heavily armoured horsemen could survive the arrow storms that had broken French cavalry in previous battles. But this very breakthrough removed the Milanese from the decisive combat, as they pursued routed archers and plundered the baggage train rather than supporting the central melee. When English archers rallied and rejoined the fight, attacking the Franco-Scottish flanks and rear, their impact was immediate and devastating. At close range, against targets already engaged in melee combat, the longbow's penetrating power found abundant vulnerabilities. Men fighting hand-to-hand presented their flanks and backs to archer fire. They could not effectively shield themselves while also defending against immediate threats. Armour gaps that might seem minor under normal circumstances became fatal weaknesses when arrows struck from unexpected angles. The longbow's rate of fire proved as important as its penetrating power. A skilled archer could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute, creating a continuous rain of projectiles. Over the course of a prolonged melee, this volume of fire accumulated casualties that ground down enemy formations. Even if most arrows deflected harmlessly off armour, the few that found vulnerable points killed or wounded. The psychological pressure of constant arrow fire, never knowing when the next shaft might find a gap in your armour, wore down morale and cohesion. The combination of these weapons in trained hands, coordinated by competent commanders, created a tactical system that dominated European battlefields for nearly a century. The longbow disrupted enemy formations and inflicted casualties at range. Bills and poleaxes destroyed those formations in close combat, with billmen dragging enemies out of position, while men-at-arms delivered killing blows. When formations broke, all three weapons contributed to the slaughter, archers shooting down fleeing soldiers while men-at-arms and billmen pursued and finished the routing enemy. The aftermath of Verneuil reverberated across Europe. For Scotland, the battle represented catastrophic loss. Two of the kingdom's most powerful nobles lay dead in French soil, along with thousands of their followers. The dream of supporting France while weakening the old enemy England had turned into nightmare. King James I, recently returned from English captivity, decided Scotland had paid enough for French friendship. No more major Scottish expeditions would cross to France during his reign. For France, Verneuil represented existential crisis. Charles VII's field army had been destroyed. English forces now controlled Normandy, Maine, and much of northern France. The Burgundian alliance with England remained strong, keeping eastern France under hostile control. For 5 more years, English dominance would continue, until a teenage peasant girl from Lorraine, claiming to hear voices from God, would arrive at Charles's court and begin the chain of events that would finally turn French fortunes. For England, Verneuil marked the high point of Henry V's legacy. Bedford had proven himself worthy of his brother's confidence, defeating a numerically superior enemy and securing English conquests for another generation. But the victory's very completeness contained the seeds of future problems. English nobles and soldiers came to believe they were invincible, that French armies would always break under English arms. This overconfidence would cost them dearly when French forces, reorganised and reinvigorated by Joan of Arc, began winning battles in the 1430s. The military lessons of Verneuil influenced warfare for decades. Continental commanders studied the battle, trying to understand how the Franco-Scottish forces had failed despite numerical superiority and the successful cavalry breakthrough. The conclusion many drew was that dismounted men-at-arms, while necessary to survive English arrow fire, created formations too rigid to exploit tactical opportunities. The Milanese success in breaking through English archers suggested that sufficiently heavy cavalry could still be effective, but their subsequent failure to support the main battle demonstrated the need for better coordination. English commanders drew different lessons. Verneuil confirmed that their tactical system, when properly applied, could defeat larger enemy forces. The combination of longbows, bills, and men-at-arms remained the foundation of English military doctrine. But thoughtful commanders also noted how close the battle had been. The Milanese breakthrough had created genuine danger. If the cavalry had rallied and returned to support the central melee instead of plundering baggage, the battle might have ended differently. The battle also demonstrated the growing importance of professional soldiers over feudal levies. The English army at Verneuil consisted primarily of men who fought for pay, contracted to serve for specified periods. They trained regularly, followed orders, and maintained discipline even under stress. The Franco-Scottish forces, while including professionals, also contained feudal levies of varying quality. The difference in cohesion and effectiveness was stark. Verneuil marked the culmination of tactical developments that had begun at Crécy nearly 80 years earlier. English combined arms warfare, with longbows providing firepower while heavy infantry provided staying power, had evolved into a sophisticated system that could defeat the mounted nobility that had dominated European warfare for centuries. The bill, an implement of agricultural labour transformed into a weapon of war, symbolised how English warfare drew strength from all levels of society, not just the mounted aristocracy. The individual experiences of men who fought at Verneuil have largely been lost to history. We know the names of noble commanders, preserved in chronicles and official records, but the archers who rallied after being scattered by cavalry, the Billmen who dragged French knights from their saddles, the common soldiers who pursued fleeing enemies through the August afternoon, their names and stories died with them. What remains is the collective story of armies clashing, of tactical systems tested to breaking point, of a battle that helped determine which kingdom would control France. In the broader sweep of the 100 Years' War, Verneuil stands as one of the great English victories, worthy of comparison to Crécy, Poitiers and Agincourt. Jean de Wavrin, who witnessed all these battles, considered Verneuil the most fiercely fought. The brutal 45-minute melee, where neither side gained advantage until English numbers and weapons finally ground down Franco-Scottish resistance, represented medieval combat at its most savage. The fields outside Verneuil, soaked with blood and covered with 6,000 corpses, bore testimony to the terrible effectiveness of English billmen and men-at-arms in close combat. The longbow's fame has overshadowed the unglamorous but deadly work of infantrymen wielding polearms. At Verneuil, it was ultimately the bill and the poleaxe that broke the Franco-Scottish formations and transformed organised resistance into panicked flight. Bedford's victory secured English power in France for another 5 years and validated the tactical legacy his brother Henry V had left him. The regent had proven himself a worthy successor, capable of command in the most demanding circumstances. His use of combined arms, his personal leadership in combat, and his army's disciplined execution under pressure demonstrated that English military excellence survived its greatest champion's death. For the Scots and French who survived, Verneuil was trauma that would haunt memories for decades. The Scottish contingent, which had marched onto the field 5,000 or 6,000 strong, virtually ceased to exist. Those who escaped carried stories of systematic destruction, of English billmen hooking Scottish warriors out of formation, of poleaxes smashing through armour, of arrows striking from unexpected angles as formations disintegrated. These survivors knew they had witnessed something terrible, the complete destruction of an army by an enemy that refused to break. August 17th, 1424, the sun that had risen on 2 armies preparing for battle, set on a field transformed into a charnel house. The English longbow had played its part, but it was English billmen who had shattered French knights and Scottish warriors in brutal close combat. The bill, humble agricultural tool turned weapon of war, had proven as deadly as any sword or lance wielded by armoured nobility. In the hands of English infantry at Verneuil, it became the instrument that maintained English dominance in France, and wrote another bloody chapter in the endless war between kingdoms. The strategic context that made Verneuil necessary began months before the battle itself, rooted in the complicated web of alliances, territorial claims, and dynastic ambitions that characterised 15th century European politics. To understand why thousands of men died in those Norman fields, one must understand the situation Bedford faced in the months leading to August 1424. Henry V's death in August 1422 had created a power vacuum that threatened to unravel English conquest in France. The great warrior king, who had crushed French power at Agincourt and forced the Treaty of Troyes that recognised English claims to the French throne, died of dysentery at the age of 35 while campaigning to expand his holdings. His death left a 9-month-old infant, Henry VI, as nominal king of both England and France, a situation that invited challenges from every direction. The Treaty of Troyes, signed in 1420, had been imposed on France after years of English military success. It disinherited the French Dauphin Charles, son of King Charles VI, declaring him illegitimate and recognising Henry V and his heirs as rightful kings of France. The treaty had been accepted by the Duke of Burgundy, whose vast territories in eastern France and the Low Countries made him the most powerful French noble, and by the mad King Charles VI himself, whose mental illness had left him incapable of effective resistance. But the Dauphin Charles, despite being legally disinherited, had never accepted the treaty. He maintained a rival court south of the Loire River, claiming to be the true King of France, and worked ceaselessly to undermine English power. Bedford, as regent for the infant Henry VI, faced enemies on multiple fronts. the Dauphin's forces controlled much of central and southern France. The remnants of the Armagnac faction, French nobles who had opposed Burgundian power and now allied with Charles, raided English-held territories from their bases in the Loire Valley. Scottish mercenaries, veterans of years of fighting, provided Charles with professional troops who could face English armies without the psychological burden of previous defeats. And always there was the possibility that the Duke of Burgundy, whose alliance with England was based on mutual advantage rather than loyalty, might switch sides if circumstances changed. The summer of 1424 brought these tensions to crisis. A combined Franco-Scottish army under the command of the Earl of Douglas and the newly appointed Constable Buchan had been raiding deep into Normandy, threatening English control of the province. They had captured several towns and were besieging Ivry-la-Bataille, an important fortress that guarded the approaches to Normandy from the south. Bedford, recognising that unchecked, these raids would eventually erode English power through 1,000 cuts, decided to force a decisive battle. The decision to seek battle represented calculated risk. Medieval commanders generally avoided pitched battles unless circumstances strongly favoured them, because the stakes were so high. An army destroyed could not be quickly replaced. Nobles captured meant ruinous ransoms. Territory lost might take years to recover. But Bedford understood that allowing the Franco-Scottish forces to operate freely would be equally disastrous. English power in France rested on the perception of invincibility, the belief that English armies could not be beaten in open combat. That perception had to be maintained through victory, not caution. Bedford marched south from Rouen with perhaps 10,000 men, a substantial force drawn from garrisons across Normandy and reinforced by troops recently arrived from England. His army included veterans of Henry V's campaigns, men who had fought at Agincourt or in the grueling siege warfare that had followed. They knew their business, understood their weapons, and trusted their commanders. This professional corps gave Bedford confidence that his army could perform under pressure. The Franco-Scottish commanders, learning of Bedford's approach, lifted the siege of Ivry and withdrew to Verneuil, where they took up defensive positions. They had been joined by the 2,000 Milanese cavalry, whose arrival transformed the strategic calculation. With this heavy cavalry force, the Franco-Scottish army possessed a weapon the English genuinely feared. Armoured horsemen, who might be able to achieve what French cavalry had failed to do, at Agincourt smash through English formations and create the chaos necessary for victory. The armies manoeuvred around Verneuil for several days, each commander seeking advantageous terrain while avoiding positions that favoured the enemy. Bedford wanted open ground where his archers could deploy effectively, with secure flanks that could not be easily turned. The Franco-Scottish commanders wanted terrain that would channel English forces into killing zones where the Milanese cavalry could strike decisively. Neither got exactly what they wanted. The field eventually chosen, about a mile north of Verneuil, on the road to Damville, was a compromise, open enough for cavalry manoeuvre but flat enough for infantry deployment. The night before battle, both armies prepared for what everyone knew would be a decisive engagement. Soldiers checked weapons and armour, making repairs where necessary. Archers inspected their bowstrings, knowing that a broken string at the wrong moment meant death. Men-at-arms tested the articulation of their armour joints, ensuring nothing would bind or restrict movement. Priests heard confessions and conducted masses, offering spiritual comfort to men who knew many of them would be dead by sunset the next day. Bedford spent the evening inspecting his formations and consulting with his commanders. He knew the battle plan had to be flexible enough to respond to unexpected developments while maintaining the basic structure that had proven successful in previous engagements. The archers would deploy on the wings with their protective stakes. The men-at-arms would form the centre, ready to receive enemy attacks or advance when opportunity presented. Reserves would be held back to exploit success or shore up weaknesses. It was the same basic plan the English had used for 80 years, but it worked because it played to English strengths while minimising weaknesses. In the Franco-Scottish camp, commanders faced harder decisions. The presence of the Milanese cavalry offered new possibilities, but also created coordination challenges. The Italian mercenaries operated under their own commanders and followed their own tactical doctrines, which did not necessarily align with French or Scottish practices. Integrating them into the overall battle plan required careful negotiation and clear communication, neither of which would survive contact with the reality of battle. The Scottish contingent, in particular, entered the battle with high expectations based on their victory at Beaujeu 3 years earlier. That battle had seen Scottish men-at-arms, fighting dismounted in rough terrain, defeat an English force and kill the Duke of Clarence, Henry V's brother. The victory had elevated Scottish military prestige and earned Buchan his position as Constable of France. Scottish soldiers believed they had discovered the formula for beating English armies: get close enough that English archery could not dominate, fight hand-to-hand where Scottish warriors could prove their mettle. What they had not fully appreciated was that Beaujeu had been fought in enclosed terrain where English longbowmen could not deploy effectively, and that Clarence had made tactical errors that cost him his life. Verneuil would be different. The morning of August 17th dawned clear and hot, typical of Norman summers. As the sun rose higher, temperatures climbed, making the weight in armour increasingly uncomfortable. Men-at-arms in full-plate armour, wearing padded gambesons underneath their steel shells, sweated profusely in the August heat. Water became precious. Some men, fearing they would not survive to drink it, consumed their water rations early, a decision they would regret as the day wore on. The psychological pressure of waiting for battle was almost as draining as the physical discomfort. Men knew that within hours, many of them would be dead or maimed. The uncertainty of when the battle would begin, who would survive, whether they would distinguish themselves or break in panic, gnawed at nerves already strained by heat and exhaustion. Some men vomited from tension. Others compulsively checked and rechecked equipment, seeking comfort in familiar rituals. Veterans recognized the signs and knew they would pass once combat began, when training and instinct would take over from conscious thought. Bedford used the morning to make final adjustments to his deployment. He positioned himself with the men-at-arms in the centre, where his presence would be most visible and his poleaxe most effective. Sir John de la Pole commanded one wing, Sir William Oldhall the other. Both were experienced commanders who understood English tactics and could be trusted to execute the battle plan without detailed supervision. The archers received final instructions on engagement ranges and were reminded not to waste arrows on heavily armoured targets when better targets presented themselves. Around noon, both armies began their final advance toward contact. The movement was slow and deliberate, with formations maintaining cohesion as they crossed the open ground. Men walked rather than ran, preserving energy for the brutal work ahead. Musicians played, drums beating a steady rhythm that helped maintain formation spacing. Banners marked unit positions, allowing commanders to track their forces in the confusion that would follow. The initial English cheer, the traditional battle cry that had accompanied English armies into combat since time immemorial, rippled through Bedford's formation as they moved forward. The sound served multiple purposes, boosting English morale while simultaneously intimidating enemies. The sheer volume of thousands of men shouting in unison created psychological pressure that could disorder enemy formations before blows were struck. When the Milanese cavalry launched their charge, the ground literally shook from the impact of thousands of hooves striking earth in near synchronization. Observers described feeling vibrations through their feet, a physical manifestation of the tremendous kinetic energy about to be unleashed against English lines. The cavalry advanced at a controlled pace initially, building speed gradually to preserve horses' stamina, only breaking into full gallop for the final 100 yards. The English archers' response was immediate and professional. There was no panic, no disorder. They had trained for exactly this scenario. Cavalry charges designed to break their formations. Each archer selected targets, tracked them as they advanced, and loosed arrows at the optimal moment to maximize impact. The result was a continuous storm of projectiles, thousands of arrows in the air simultaneously, creating what contemporaries described as a cloud that darkened the sky. But these Italian cavalry represented something new in English experience. Previous cavalry charges had collapsed under arrow fire as horses died or panicked, and riders fell wounded. The French at Agincourt had lost hundreds of cavalry to arrow fire before ever reaching English lines. The Milanese, however, kept coming. Their superior armour absorbed punishment that would have stopped earlier cavalry forces. Dead horses fell, but others surged over them. Wounded riders stayed in their saddles through sheer determination, driving forward even as blood ran down their armour. The moment when Milanese cavalry smashed through the protective stakes represented technological progress, overcoming traditional defences. Those stakes had stopped cavalry at Agincourt, creating barriers of writhing horses and dying men that blocked subsequent charges. But the Italian cavalry, better armoured and better trained, simply rode over or through the obstacles. Their horses, trained for exactly this kind of assault and protected by steel barding, did not balk at the barriers. The cavalry's momentum carried them through and into the English archer formation beyond. What followed was chaos. Archers, trained to fight from behind protective barriers with space to use their bows, found themselves in close-quarters melee with mounted knights. Many dropped their bows and drew sidearms, short swords or axes they carried for exactly this eventuality. But these weapons were poor matches for mounted cavalry. Knights on horseback possessed tremendous advantages in reach and striking power. An armoured man on a 15-hand warhorse could strike downward at standing infantry, using gravity and his mount's height to add force to his blows. The English archers broke. It was not cowardice, but simple survival instinct. Men facing impossible odds scattered, seeking any escape from the immediate threat of death. Some ran toward the baggage park, others toward the flanks, still others simply sprinted away from the cavalry, hoping to outrun the armoured horsemen. The Milanese pursued, cutting down some fleeing archers while driving others before them like frightened sheep. The collapse of one archer wing could have been catastrophic. If the Milanese had wheeled and struck the English men-at-arms in the flank while they were engaged with the Franco-Scottish forces from the front, Bedford's entire formation might have collapsed. Medieval battles frequently turned on exactly such flanking manoeuvres, where attacks from unexpected directions shattered formations and triggered general panic. But the Milanese, flushed with success and seeing the English baggage park undefended, made the fatal decision to pursue plunder rather than tactical advantage. The baggage park represented tempting targets for medieval cavalry. The wagons contained not just military supplies, but also the personal possessions of English soldiers, including their horses, armour, spare weapons, and whatever valuables they had accumulated. For mercenaries like the Milanese, who fought primarily for profit, looting an enemy baggage train was as valuable as battlefield victory. They dismounted and began ransacking the wagons, fighting with the small guard force Bedford had left behind. This decision to plunder rather than fight removed 2,000 cavalry from the decisive combat. While the Milanese were enriching themselves in the English rear, the battle's outcome was being decided in the brutal melee between Bedford's men-at-arms and the Franco-Scottish formation. The cavalry's absence meant the Franco-Scottish forces faced English heavy infantry without the cavalry support that might have tipped the balance in their favour. The central melee began when Scottish and French men-at-arms crashed into Bedford's line with shocking violence. The sound of impact, thousands of armoured men colliding at walking pace, carried across the battlefield, a crash of steel on steel punctuated by the screams of wounded men and the shouted war cries of combatants. What followed was not the romanticised individual combat of later legend, but compressed, brutal violence where men packed so tightly could barely move. Fighting in such conditions required specific techniques. A man could not wind up for a full swing when comrades pressed against him on both sides and enemies crowded his front. Instead, combatants used short, controlled strikes, jabbing and chopping rather than swinging. Poleaxes and warhammers proved ideal for these conditions, their weight and design allowing powerful blows even with restricted movement. Bills hooked and dragged, creating momentary openings that others could exploit. Swords thrust into gaps in armour, seeking vulnerable points at joints or beneath helmet rims. The physical demands of this combat exceeded anything modern people experience. Men fought in full armour, plate harnesses weighing 50 to 60 pounds, while wearing padded gambesons underneath that added another 15 to 20 pounds. The August heat turned armour into ovens, cooking the men inside. Within minutes, combatants were gasping for breath, muscles burning from the constant exertion of swinging weapons and supporting armour's weight. But stopping to rest meant death. Men fought through exhaustion because the alternative was being killed while they recovered. Bedford's personal combat, wading into the melee with his poleaxe, represented medieval leadership at its most direct and dangerous. Modern commanders direct battles from command posts, using technology to maintain situational awareness while staying removed from personal danger. Medieval commanders had no such luxury. They fought in the front ranks because their presence inspired their men, and because medieval command and control required commanders to be where they could see what was happening and personally direct responses. The poleaxe Bedford wielded was approximately 6 feet long, topped with a head combining a hammer face, an axe blade, and a spike. In his hands, this weapon became devastatingly effective. The hammer face could deliver crushing blows that bent armor inward, snapping bones without penetrating the steel. Against an opponent wearing a helmet, a hammer strike to the head produced concussive effects, even if the helmet held, leaving the victim dazed or unconscious. The axe blade could chop through mail or cut into plate armor if struck at favourable angles, and the spike could thrust through gaps or batter through weakened sections. Contemporary descriptions of Bedford felling everyone he reached were not mere propaganda. A skilled warrior wielding a poleaxe in close combat possessed overwhelming advantages. The weapon's reach allowed strikes before opponents with swords or maces could respond. Its weight and design maximised damage with each blow. A man hit by a poleaxe hammer face might not die immediately, but he was usually incapacitated, knocked down or stunned, making him vulnerable to finishing blows from others. The Billmen working alongside Bedford's men-at-arms demonstrated how combined arms tactics functioned at the tactical level. While heavily armoured men-at-arms crashed against Franco-Scottish counterparts, Billmen used their weapons' hooks to drag enemies out of formation. A billhook catching the rim of a helmet or an armour plate could pull a man off balance, breaking his defensive stance and making him vulnerable. Bills hooked weapons, pulling them out of line and creating openings for strikes. They hooked shields, dragging them aside to expose bodies behind. Once an enemy was pulled out of formation, or knocked down, he became incredibly vulnerable. A man in full armour who fell to the ground could not easily rise without assistance. The weight and articulation of plate armour made getting up without help nearly impossible under combat conditions. Fallen warriors became targets for finishing blows, daggers thrust through armour gaps into bodies made helpless by their own protective equipment. Many of the casualties at Verneuil died not from the initial wounds that knocked them down, but from the ruthlessly efficient execution that followed. The 45-minute stalemate in the central melee represented extraordinary determination on both sides. Neither formation could gain a decisive advantage through frontal combat alone. The Scottish and French troops fought with desperation born of necessity, knowing that defeat would be catastrophic. English troops fought with the confidence of veterans who had won previous battles, but also with the understanding that this battle was different, harder, more evenly matched than Agincourt had been. The return of rallied English archers changed everything. These men, who had been scattered by the Milanese charge, recovered their composure and rejoined the fight. They did not waste time perfectly reforming their original units or retrieving their protective stakes. Instead, they simply picked up their bows, scavenged arrows from the ground where they had fallen, and moved toward positions where they could shoot into the Franco-Scottish formation. Archery at close range against targets engaged in melee was different from the long-range shooting that had characterized the battle's opening. At 50 to 100-yard ranges, archers could see individual targets, pick out specific men, and aim for visible vulnerabilities. An archer could watch for a man turning his head, exposing his neck or raising his arm, revealing the gap at his armpit. Bodkin point arrows at these ranges possessed terrible penetrating power, punching through mail and finding weak spots in plate harnesses. The psychological impact of this arrow fire on men, already engaged in exhausting close combat, cannot be overstated. Imagine fighting hand to hand, focused on the immediate threat of an opponent trying to kill you, when suddenly an arrow slams into your armour from a direction you are not watching. Even if the arrow does not penetrate, the impact creates shock and distraction. If it does penetrate, the sudden pain and bleeding break concentration and combat effectiveness. Men began to flinch at sounds that might indicate incoming arrows, disrupting their fighting stance and creating vulnerabilities. The English assault on the Scottish flank represented tactical flexibility responding to battlefield developments. Bedford's commanders, seeing the Scots under pressure from frontal assault and arrow fire, recognised an opportunity to deliver a decisive blow. They gathered available reserves, including men-at-arms who had been held back and archers who had rallied from the initial cavalry attack, and launched a coordinated strike against the Scottish formation's exposed side. Flanking attacks in medieval warfare possessed devastating power, because formations were designed to face forward. The men on a formation's flank were not positioned to defend against attacks from the side. Shields faced forward, weapons pointed forward, attention focused forward. An attack from the flank hit men who were not prepared to receive it, striking them before they could turn to meet the threat. The disorganisation this created rippled through the formation as men tried to face the new threat while still defending against frontal pressure. The Scottish formation's collapse began at the point where the flanking attack struck home. Men started to pull back, trying to create space to deal with threats from multiple directions. This backward movement created gaps in the formation that English troops exploited. Once gaps appeared, English men-at-arms and billmen poured through, getting into the formation's interior where they could attack from advantageous positions. The Scottish formation, which had been a coherent fighting unit, began fragmenting into isolated groups fighting for survival. The transformation from organised combat to rout happened with shocking speed. Medieval formations depended on mutual support and collective action for effectiveness. Once that collective action broke down, individual soldiers faced impossible odds. A man surrounded by enemies, unable to count on comrades for support, faced a simple calculation: keep fighting and die, or run and possibly survive. Most men chose survival. The Scottish formation dissolved into a mob of fleeing soldiers, each man seeking only to escape the nightmare the battlefield had become. The French formation, seeing their Scottish allies collapse, wavered on the edge of panic. Some units held together, trying to maintain their position even as their flanks became exposed by the Scottish flight. Others began pulling back, initially in good order but with cohesion fraying as the pressure mounted. Within minutes, the entire Franco-Scottish centre was retreating, some groups fighting rearguard actions while others simply fled. The pursuit that followed was where medieval battles inflicted their highest casualties. English men-at-arms and archers chased routing enemies, cutting down men from behind. A fleeing soldier could not defend himself while running. His back presented a large vulnerable target for arrows, axes and swords. Even heavily armoured men became vulnerable when fleeing because their armour's weak points, the backs of knees, the joints at shoulders and hips, the base of the helmet became exposed to pursuers. The slaughter extended for miles as English forces hunted down routing Franco-Scottish soldiers. Some fled toward Verneuil itself, seeking safety behind the town's walls, but many were cut down before reaching shelter. Others scattered across the countryside, trying to find hiding places or escape routes, but English pursuit was relentless. Small groups that tried to make stands were surrounded and destroyed. Individual soldiers were hunted down and killed or captured for ransom if they appeared wealthy enough to be worth taking alive. The deaths of both Scottish commanders, Douglas and Buchan, likely occurred during this phase of fighting. Nobles in full armour fighting on foot could defend themselves effectively against small numbers of opponents, but once surrounded and isolated, even the best warriors could be overwhelmed. Both men probably died fighting rearguard actions, trying to cover their men's retreat, or attempting to rally broken formations. Their deaths deprived the Scottish army of leadership at exactly the moment when strong command might have salvaged something from disaster. The ditch around Verneuil filled with bodies as fleeing soldiers seeking to enter the town were cut down by pursuing English forces. The narrow approaches created choke points where men packed together, unable to move quickly, became easy targets for archers and men-at-arms. Bodies piled up until they formed bridges of flesh over which later victims could cross. A horrific image that chroniclers recorded and that haunted survivors' memories. The Milanese cavalry, returning from their plundering expedition to find the battle lost, were caught in the general chaos. Some managed to fight their way out, using their armour and horsemanship to escape. Others were pulled from their horses and killed or captured. The very armour that had protected them during their successful charge now hindered their escape, making them slower and more visible than lighter-armed troops who could more easily slip away through rough terrain. The casualty figures reported by various chroniclers differ, as medieval accounts often do, but all agree the Franco-Scottish losses were catastrophic. 6,000 dead is the most commonly cited figure, though some sources report higher numbers. Even accounting for medieval exaggeration and the difficulty of accurately counting corpses scattered across miles of countryside, the losses clearly amounted to the majority of the Franco-Scottish army. When combined with prisoners taken during and after the battle, perhaps fewer than a quarter of the Franco-Scottish forces escaped. English casualties, while significantly lighter, were not trivial despite Bedford's propaganda claims of losing only 2 men-at-arms. The 45-minute central melee had been genuinely contested, with heavy fighting that must have inflicted significant casualties on both sides. Wavrin's estimate of 1,600 English dead, while possibly including wounded who died later, reflects the battle's intensity. Even this figure, however, represented less than a quarter of Franco-Scottish losses, reflecting the brutal mathematics of medieval combat where most casualties occurred during the rout. The battlefield after combat presented a scene of almost incomprehensible horror. Thousands of bodies lay scattered across the fields, many mutilated beyond recognition by the wounds that killed them. Poleaxes and warhammers had smashed skulls and crushed bones. Swords and bills had cut deep gashes in flesh. Arrows protruded from bodies at grotesque angles. The smell of blood, excrement, and death filled the air, overwhelming in its intensity. Survivors picking through the carnage, looking for wounded comrades or valuable equipment, had to step carefully to avoid slipping on blood-soaked ground. The wounded presented their own nightmare. Medieval battlefield medicine was primitive by modern standards. Doctors could set broken bones, stitch cuts, and remove arrows if they had not penetrated too deeply, but they had no antibiotics, no effective painkillers beyond alcohol and opiates, no understanding of infection beyond the most basic observation that dirty wounds went bad. Men with severe wounds, gut injuries, crushed limbs, deep penetrating trauma faced agonizing deaths over hours or days as their bodies succumbed to blood loss, shock, or infection. Some were granted mercy killings by comrades who could not bear to watch them suffer. Others died alone on the battlefield, their cries for help going unanswered in the chaos. The logistical aftermath of the battle imposed tremendous burdens on both sides. The English had to care for their wounded, dispose of enemy dead, process prisoners, and maintain security against possible counterattacks. Thousands of bodies could not simply be left to rot, creating health hazards and attracting scavengers. Mass graves were dug and bodies dumped into them with minimal ceremony, though nobles might be identified and their bodies preserved for proper burial if their families could pay ransom for their return. Prisoners represented both assets and problems. Wealthy captives could be ransomed for sums that might exceed years of a common soldier's pay, making prisoners valuable property. But prisoners also needed to be guarded, fed and transported, consuming resources the army could ill afford. The balance between a prisoner's potential ransom value and the cost of maintaining him determined whether he lived or died. Common soldiers with no ransom value were often killed rather than being allowed to consume supplies. The Dauphin Charles, receiving news of the disaster at Verneuil, faced the collapse of his military position. He had lost his best army, his most experienced commanders, and his most reliable troops in a single afternoon. The Scottish mercenaries, who had provided the core of his military strength, had been effectively annihilated. Rebuilding would require years, new alliances, and resources he did not possess. English forces now controlled Normandy and threatened to expand further south, potentially capturing territories that represented his last bases of power. For Bedford, Verneuil represented vindication of his leadership and his tactical doctrine. He had faced a larger enemy army strengthened by heavy cavalry that had broken through his archer screen, yet he had still achieved overwhelming victory. The battle demonstrated that English combined arms tactics remained effective even against enemies who had studied previous English victories and attempted to develop counter-strategies. The Billmen and poleaxemen had proven themselves capable of defeating French and Scottish heavy infantry in extended close combat, while the longbow, despite the Milanese breakthrough, had remained a decisive weapon when properly employed. The political consequences of Verneuil extended far beyond the immediate military situation. The battle secured English control of Normandy for years to come, allowing Bedford to consolidate his position and extend English administration throughout the province. Towns and nobles who might have been tempted to declare for Charles now saw that English power remained dominant and decided cooperation offered better prospects than resistance. The psychological impact of such a comprehensive English victory deterred potential opponents and strengthened Bedford's diplomatic position. For Scotland, Verneuil marked the end of major military involvement in France during the 100 Years' War. The kingdom had lost too many nobles, too many professional soldiers, and too much treasure supporting French allies. King James I recently returned from English captivity and focused on consolidating his power within Scotland, had no interest in sending more men to die in French fields. Individual Scots would continue serving as mercenaries, but Scotland as a nation withdrew from active participation in the Franco-English conflict. The weapons that decided Verneuil, the bill and the poleaxe supported by the longbow, remained the foundation of English military power for another century. The bill continued evolving, with later versions incorporating refinements based on combat experience. By the 16th century, the bill had become the standard weapon for English infantry, carried by town militias and professional soldiers alike. Its effectiveness against both cavalry and infantry made it versatile enough for varied tactical situations, while its relative simplicity allowed rapid training of new recruits. The Battle of Verneuil entered English military tradition as one of the great victories, a testament to the effectiveness of English arms and English valour. Veterans of the battle carried their memories for decades, telling and retelling stories of that August afternoon when English billmen shattered French knights and Scottish warriors. The battle became a reference point for later generations, proof that English soldiers properly led and equipped could defeat any enemy regardless of numerical odds. In the end, Verneuil demonstrated truths about medieval warfare that transcended the specific circumstances of that battle. Victory required more than courage or numbers. It demanded tactical flexibility, combined arms coordination, disciplined execution under pressure, and the willingness of commanders to lead from the front. Bedford and his English army possessed all these qualities. Their Franco-Scottish opponents, despite fighting with equal courage and determination, lacked the tactical cohesion and combined arms effectiveness that English armies had perfected through decades of warfare. The result was not just English victory, but the systematic destruction of an enemy army, achieved through the devastating effectiveness of English billmen wielding their unglamorous but deadly polearms in brutal close combat,